Hello and welcome back to another episode. I'm Luke, the Crazy Maker Nerd. Today we're going to be building a Heretic Legion Warband using nothing other than kitbashing a number of historical miniatures and the odd bit of Warhammer. So the idea is that we make something that looks like it's crawled out of the most soul-crushing, disgusting, muddy, trench warfare imaginable, tainted in pure chaos. Think World War I army meets chaos from Warhammer in the kind of extra grim dark on top of what we would expect from Warhammer. For the base we're going to be using some fantastic miniatures from Vixtrix and Wargames Atlantic. And to really nail that historical accuracy, we're leaning heavily on Osprey Publishing's Men-at-Arms series. Specifically, we'll be looking at the German uniforms from 1915 to 1917. This period gives us some very smart looking options for an imperial drab, slightly greenish uniform, mixed in with a slightly worn utilitarian look, which is perfect for a Heretic Legion Warband. We'll be pulling all of our colour schemes directly from these pages, aiming for something that could be authentic, but definitely grimdark, and of an alternative universe.
Wibbly wobbly, timey wimey stuff.
Firstly, planning a warband. So luckily, Trench Companion exists. It's a brilliant website where you can build your warband with predetermined point allocations. And yeah, the Germans?
Come on then. For the Germans get.
Blame lock, stock and two smoking barrels. So I made a complete list on the website, and then I printed it out. You can customize the format when you print it out, and that's great. Makes a very happy Luke for ticking stuff off as we go. Next up, let's go to my mini library and put out some of those Men-at-Arms books. Specifically, the German Army in World War I, Part 2. In here is an in-depth history into the German Army of that time period, but most importantly in the middle of the book is complete colour illustrations of all the uniform types of that time period. And because they're printed out, it means that they are portable and change under the same light as other things in the room, which is really useful when holding them up against my war paints to try and work out which ones to use. Today we're mainly going to be using Vixtrix Medieval Foot Knights, which are utterly brilliant. I mean, just look at the way that the manual is divided so that you can see exactly what goes together. Utterly brilliant. We're also going to be using Wargames Atlantic World War I Germans, which I've already broken down into bits boxes so I can use them for kit bashing in the future. So I put out some rifles, some helmets, all the bits that I think would be useful for my warband list. And then I began cutting and sticking together the first miniature. Starting off by gluing it initially with just some poly cement and then using some sprue glue when larger gaps between the two types of kits might be more prominent. After attaching, I then use a bit more poly cement just to smooth down these areas. I really love these miniatures because they have such fantastic dynamic poses just out of the box. I then glued all the miniatures down to essentially the default bases, which will be trimmed and updated later. And of course, it wouldn't be complete without that wonderful World War I gas mask, really completing that Heretic Legion aesthetic. I also went between the medieval foot knights and the various World War I and World War II-ish items in my bits box to try and populate the belts with all of the items seen on the army list. We want what you see is what you get. And as I said, the great thing about these army lists being printed out, I can tick stuff off and write build when I finish the miniature. I then repeated this process for a few more miniatures, but the one difference was I had to use some World War II American parts, specifically the shotgun from this kit, so that I could then make the shotgun trooper. I also used some sprue goo and an Astra Militarum backpack, along with what I think might be a Space Marine or Astra Militarum flamethrower, to try and make this flamethrower version of a Heretic Trooper. With enough glue and sprue goo, anything is possible. Here you can see that I've cut down the original bases and now I'm gluing them onto some Citadel bases, just so they look a little bit more, I kind of want to say premium. Next for the Anointed Heavy Infantry guy. This is made up of essentially Fantasy Chaos Knights, where I've taken all of that chaosy detailing off of the armour to make it plain armour. I then also used an old-fashioned monopose Space Marine set of legs, which I cut up and made less monopose. And I also added some large, I think they're troll skulls, to be like pauldrons on the armour as well, kind of making it a more original look. When I glued the torso and the legs together and they dried, I then put them together. But when holding them up against a normal Heretic Trooper, I did realise they were a little bit small. Not great for someone to be towering. So I pulled it apart again, and now I found another torso, cut it up, added some of these like tabars from other kits, stuck them together, and just to make him a little bit taller and yeah, much better. When it was done, I put him into the slotter base using the original slot, and moved on to putting some masking tape on him. Now this is so that I can make a tabard around his waist, and then I used a very thin piece of masking tape and some super glue to then also make a belt afterwards. This is a very simple technique, and I would recommend it if you're on a budget or you really don't want to bother with using, lots of sculpting clay. It gets so messy doing thin layers. I also cut off a shield and tried to bodge basically his wrist because it looked a little bit bad from where there wasn't a shield on there, trying to make it look like an armor plate. Next up, I made the Artillery Witch. Now this is a weird one. So I start out with a knight and a head from German World War I, cut off the top of the head from German World War I, and then put a Kroot skull on top from the skulls kit that GW used to sell. And then I find some random bomb, I think it was from this Orc Spitfire build, put some sprue goo on the end of it and kind of use the plastic cement to try and make it look like it's magic going up the side of the bomb. Then I glue it in the hand, cover most of the model in masking tape to try and make like this kind of robe thing, cover up the link between the two heads with kind of like an eye mask as if there's no eyes there anymore, and then just trying to finish it off with a bit of super glue and a lot of patience. I'm not certain about this one yet, but it might look better with paint, so let's keep going and hope for the best. I also glued on a few other extra details like a combat knife and a shield, just so it was exactly what's said on the army list. No confusion, hopefully, could be had. I essentially used the main body from the medieval foot soldiers, gave him 2 arms holding grenades, and just covered him in even more grenades. Hope he doesn't go off. I then decided to fashion a scarf thing, kind of like a priest scarf, I guess, out of some more masking tape, just so that he would look a bit more different to the normal Heretic Troopers. Then I moved on to the Heretic Priest, and for this I used another one of the foot soldiers and kind of didn't put a head on, made him hold a decapitated head that came with the medieval foot knights, and then I used these thin bits of sprue bent with a lighter and then glued into place, and just for a bit of comedy value, then balanced the German helmet on top. Kind of like his head just kind of popped off, but the helmet stayed there. I also added all the extra necessities from the army list, and then glued all of the rest of the characters down to their bases, covering up any slaughter bases that might cause a problem in a minute. Because I'm going to use PVA and my mud mixture to base these. Very quickly, very nicely. Then they were prepared for spray painting. So firstly, I used a grey spray paint from Army Painter, and then I used a mixture of Mod Podge and Rhinox hide, which I've been using for the last few years for all of my basing with trenchy bases. It just adds the colour straight away, and it seals down all that sand that might otherwise be pushed off. Once that was all dry, I moved on to using Army Painter Deep Grey on the helmet. This is to try and match the source material of the World War I German helmets, which were a lot darker than the actual main uniforms. I then took creative liberty and put matte black all over the gas masks to make them look more rubbery and more grimdark. Following that, I used a nice bright silver from Army Painter all over the plate mail and over all those little greebly bits and gun sections. With the grey now completely dry, I moved on to putting a military shade wash all over, and this is because the source material has this greenish tinge, at least in some of the uniforms. Next up, Strap Grey. I use this to paint the gloves as if they're a thick rubber, maybe leather, and add a bit of definition to the gas mask, specifically the lenses. Furthermore, I also put it all over the backpack of the guy with the flamethrower, just so that he had something a little bit different. And on top of that, the Artillery Witch's shield was also painted in this colour. Following this, I used Mud Splatter, which is a orangey brown, which I always use for something like leathery bits. I just whacked it all over, all leathery bits. All the wooden pieces. And all the handles to the grenades. Just so they're all kind of within the same palette. Next up, I noticed that the backpacks they used to wear were like a skeleton bony colour, so I used skeleton bone all over the canvassy things and the leg wraps on some of the troopers. I also used the same colour on all of the skin so that it looked kind of sickly even after all the layers later on. And I don't really know what the crew hair thing is, so I just painted that as well. Next up, I used gun metal, and this was for all of those metallic pieces which I hadn't yet touched. Just putting out all those little details here and there, on the belt, on the weapons. Now for matte white. I used this solely to cover the entire bomb held by the witch, so that I could then put a translucent layer on later on to kind of make it look like it was a magic-y thing happening. Now I used pure red. This is essentially the base coat where all the blood is pouring out of this poor priest's neck and on the underside of his head. Now, I wouldn't recommend trying this. I used red tone on top of the scarf. It doesn't look very good, so we'll come to that later with a bit of a cover-up method. Now, I took inspiration here from World War I British uniforms, all the gas mask tubes. So I thought I'd cover all of the flamethrower tubes in a similar colour, so it felt like of the same time period. Next, I used uniform grey on the centre of the lenses to add a little bit further definition to the other two colours. Following this, Brain Matter Beige was used on all of the blonde hair as a base colour. I also decided to cover the crew again on this. I felt it was more hair-like. Next up, let's cover up that scarf that went wrong with Blood Angel's red contrast paint. I want to use red because the WW1 Germans appear to have red insignias and ranks all over their uniforms, so red feels like a good in keeping colour. Slaver it on, and yes, much better now. Now dark tones used on all of the areas which doesn't have a shade already or a contrast paint, just to try and bring out all the definition of the models. Equally, the flesh areas, I used Guilliman Flesh contrast paint to add a bit of warmth to the faces. I also don't know why, but I painted the Kroot's hair again. And then I used Nighthaunt Gloom on the bomb and then wipe off excess using a piece of kitchen roll to show those high points as white. Next up, bringing out that bright and vibrant yellow colour using iodine yellow for all of the blonde hair. With all the contrasts and washes dry, I then moved on to highlighting using uniform grey on all of the high points of the jackets, capes and robes. Deep grey was then used to bring out the higher points of the helmet where the shadows wouldn't be, making the helmet look a bit more like it's got a defined outline. Then mud splatter was used to add a bit of texture and a bit more definition onto all of the leathery bits. For the scabbard and the hilt of the sword, I used a scratching motion to accomplish the extra detail. Further to this, rifle brown was used on, yep, you guessed it, the rifle and the shotgun. I try my best to imitate a wood grain using the rifle brown along the stock and the butt of the guns. Tainted gold was then used to kind of imitate a temper colour on the end of the flamethrower where it would have kind of changed with heat, and I also added a little bit to the anointed heavy infantry armour just to make it look a bit more twisted and worn. I then kind of wet dry brushed brain matter onto all of the hair of all the characters that had hair. And then moved on to adding some definition with opal skin on all of the fleshy bits. A fluffy effect was then put onto the scarf using Brain Matter Beige, and matte white was used on the highest points of the magic effect to make it look a bit more glowy. The next method was a bit of an experiment. I bought these nail stamping kits with lots of iconography, some red lacquer nail stamping solution and a nail stamper. and I essentially applied this lacquer to certain symbols and then stamped them onto areas of the Witch's Shield and the gauntlet thing for the Anointed Heavy Infantryman. And you know what? It worked. They cost less than a £10 on AliExpress, and I would recommend. Now for Blood for the Blood God, the best technical paint, which I put all over the exploding blood, the bayonet, the sword, and a little bit dripping from the Artillery Witch's eye sockets. With most of the models basically painted, I moved on to using mud splatter, dry brushing all over the bases and some of the bottom of the clothing to make them look a little bit muddy. This was to add an extra level of realism, as if they've been trudging through these disgusting muddy trenches for a long time. Finally, I've come up with a decent use for Citadel pots, to put miniatures on to paint the base rims. Then, to finish it off, I used Game Colour Earth from Vallejo, and that was it.
The following statement was issued. Owing to some rejection, the request made by assurances that neutrality be respected. Ambassador has received his passport and has declared that the state of war exists.
And just like that, we have some fantastic Heretic Legion miniatures, perfect for a Trench Crusade warband. And what you see is what you get. To the point system of the game. Thank you for stopping by and watching this build process and painting tutorial. If you have any suggestions for future videos, make sure you put them in the comments section below. I'd love to hear your ideas. Who knows, they might turn into a video. And whilst you're down there commenting, hit that like, subscribe and bell icon below. They're free to do, and they help the channel out a massive amount. Also, don't forget that there's loads of free 3D printable files on my MakerWorld profile. Most recently, I have designed an insert for the XL Crusade case from Citadel, which is now discontinued, but it's a way to upgrade that case so you can put magnetic trays in from companies such as our previous sponsor, Warmag, which means that I can now carry around my miniatures and not worry about them breaking as soon as I take them out of that very, very bad foam. But, as always, until next time, I'll see you later, my nerds. What are you still doing here? Go kitbash some stuff.